be here, and especially, as Drew said, to talk to teachers, because, you know, you're our link to the future, because you are teaching our students now and tomorrow. And if they don't learn about history, then we're doomed to repeat it. And we've come close several times. So I'm going to tell you about this little guy. This is my daddy at 4 years old, Red Korematsu. And certainly, usually you don't say to a child, well, someday you're going to grow up to be an American civil rights hero. It doesn't usually happen that way. So when I talk to students, I tell them that you never know what's going to happen in life. That my father was one man who made a difference, and they can too. When faced with those decisions, they have a great responsibility that it goes beyond themselves. This is my father and his family and my grandparents in a flower nursery in East Oakland, California. My father was born in Oakland, California, and was an American citizen. Before the war, I mean, my grandfather actually was able to buy land before the Alien Law Land took into effect on August 10th, 1913. And after that time, then, if you were an immigrant, you couldn't buy land. But fortunately, he was able to, and was built this nursery, flower nursery, next to the house where my father and his other three brothers were born. And he was the third son of 4 boys. So he was always like the odd man out. He was always told, you know, what to do and the chores that he had to take on to do the watering and the gardening and the painting and whatever task that the other brothers didn't want to do. This little guy in the front is my father with a sailor suit. I think this is kind of a hand-me-down. But you can see that this is, you know, the type of picture that was taken every few years for families to send over to Japan. So my father went to high school, Castlemont High School in Oakland, and he experienced discrimination early in life. And we're talking, I think you're talking about Justice Jackson's head of hair. But, you know, certainly my father had this wonderful head of hair. And up until about high school time, my grandmother would cut my father's hair. And my father got to the point where, you know, all of his friends were going to barbershops, and he wanted to get his hair cut by a real barber. So he went to the little town San Leandro, which was really only about a block and a half of the borderline next to Oakland. So it was, you know, fairly close. And he walked into a barbershop, you know, with that candy cane pole. And the barber says to my father, "Hey boy, what do you want?" And my father said, "Well, I want a haircut." And the barber says, "We don't cut hair of your kind. You get out of here. You go down to Chinatown. You don't belong here." And started calling, you know, racist names. And my father was really, you know, hurt. He was a very sensitive, you know, person, and didn't quite understand, you know, what was going on. And then several months later, he was delivering some flowers for my grandfather in San Leandro, and decided to go to a coffee shop. And walked in, and the cook behind the counter said, "Hey, what do you want?" And my father said, "Well, I want to get something to eat." And the cook said, "No, you don't belong here. Get out of here. You go down to Chinatown in Oakland. You don't belong here." And again, you know, called him racist names. And so that was his experience, you know, with racism. I mean, it wasn't like one day he decided, you know, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor that he was going to resist the military orders. I mean, those types of experiences build up in you as you grow. This is taken in the flower nursery, as you can see, and my father is about 21 at the time, and This is my Uncle Hai. He was the oldest. And especially in Asian families, usually the first son is, doted on the most. And this is my Uncle Harry. He was the second oldest. I call him like the spare to the heir. And this is my Uncle Joe. He was the baby, so he was, doted on and could do no wrong. And then my father, who seemed to, I always thought the dynamics of this photograph was very interesting. But, certainly my grandfather had worked very hard for this nursery. And you could see how proud that he is. So we all know what this picture is, and it's amazing, even elementary school kids know that this is the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And they may not know exactly the date, but my experience growing up in the Bay Area, in the San Francisco Bay Area, I was born in Oakland, but went to schools in suburbs. So there was a lot of Caucasian kids, and around this time, I would always find excuses not to ride the school bus because the kids would say to me, well, the bombing of Pearl Harbor is your fault. You don't belong here. You go back to Japan. And then they would call me names as well. And so it was an experience that was always very hurtful this time of the year. And it wasn't until my brother graduated from high school, and my brother is 4 years younger, that he had the same experience. But he never said anything to my parents as well. So with the issue of Executive Order 9066, which I always found interesting that this gave the military the authority to force remove anybody of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. It was kind of, my thoughts came to that time after 9/11. And we know that, we can't let our military rule this country. But my father had to make a decision. What was he going to do? He didn't think this was right, to have to leave his home. And so he stayed behind. He didn't report to the detention assembly centers like everyone else did. And these signs started going up all up and down the West Coast. And this could be the title of my father's story, I'm an American. So what does it mean to be an American in this country? Certainly my father was questioning, this because, people just didn't know where they stood. They were born in this country, but they were told they were disloyal. They never had any day in court. This map shows in particular the West Coast. There's this demarcation line that runs all the way kind of from New Mexico up through California, through Oregon and Washington. And to the west side of this was Zone 1. So when the military first gave the orders, they said if you're in Zone 1, then you had to report to these detention assembly centers. But then they had to expand it to Zone 2. With Manzanar is one of the 10 detention concentration camps, and Tule Lake is at the top here near the Oregon border. So, if you lived in Zone 1 and Zone 2, then you had to report. It's interesting, I spoke in Scottsdale at the beginning of the year, and it doesn't show here, but Phoenix was divided right in the middle. And so if you were west of that line, you had to report. And then if you were east of that line, then you didn't. So there were families that lived on the east side of Zone 2, but the kids went to high school in Zone 1. So then it became a real problem because they couldn't, the order said you can't go into that other zone, right? It was kind of a dilemma. You can't go in, you can't leave, you stay there, you're guilty. It was really ridiculous the way that these orders were written. But so then the kids had to go to other schools in the zone that they lived in, and there was a lot of discrimination because they didn't have to report to these detention assembly centers. You only had 48 hours to decide what you're going to take with you. So imagine this. You have a whole household full of things, right? And you have to decide what you can take with you, because all you can take with you is what you can carry in 2 hands, and that included bedding. Then you had to leave behind your possessions, maybe with friends, hoping that they would, take care of them, or sell them, or get rid of them. In a lot of cases, the friends that had your possessions, a lot of people didn't even think that anybody was coming back home, that the Japanese and Japanese Americans were not coming back home. I mean, and 2/3 of this population, so there's like 120,000 people incarcerated, and 70% of those people were Americans, were Japanese Americans. And it was very sad that, I felt for my grandmother. I thought, here's this elegant Japanese woman who came over from Japan thinking that, this is the land of opportunity, and she's been treated like a criminal. And she's done nothing wrong, and she's worked so hard to raise a family, to build up a life that she can be proud of. And it's totally been stripped away from her for no reason that anybody can give them, except you look like the enemy. So people lived in the detention assembly centers. I don't have a race to add one in here, as John alluded to. So people had to first report to these detention assembly centers, and basically they were racetracks, or they would find fairgrounds with racetracks in them. Some of them were some expo centers. But what they would do, like in the San Francisco Bay Area, it was Tanforan racetrack, home of Seabiscuit. You know who Seabiscuit is. And in fact, if you go there and visit, they have this big, huge statue of Seabiscuit and this little plaque about the size of this square of this top of this podium that says, well, Japanese Americans were, had a report here for the detention center. And students who see that are just kind of outraged. But they would just whitewash these horse stalls. They still smelled like manure. I mean, and the walls were, gaps, wood gaps, and a light bulb and a dirt floor. And so after my father was arrested and he had his first hearing in court, they were still there at the assembly center. So he had to go back to this assembly center. And that's when he said, gee, jail was a lot better than this. I mean, we treat animals, basically better than we even treated the Japanese and Japanese Americans at that time. And there was dysentery, and there was all these types of issues that just surround everyday living. And they had to live there for 3 to 4 months before the permanent concentration camps were built. So from the detention assembly centers, they were taken to train stations and sent across the United States. For people in the Bay Area, they went to, most of them, went to Topaz, Utah. And you can see that they have all this military that's lined up here, watching these Japanese and Japanese Americans, who I'm sure aren't really dangerous at all. And most of these soldiers had bayonets at the end of their rifles, so they'd be prodding them. And then you ended up, this is an example of one of the 10 concentration camps. And what the government did was they found Indian reservation land, desolate. See any trees? No. It was, hotter than Hades in the summertime, freezing cold in the wintertime, and all they did for these barracks for the barracks was they would have like a pot-bellied stove at each end, and then they would hang, like if you can imagine, this is a long barrack, they'd hang rope from one side to the other, and that's how they divided up the areas for each family. So there'd be several families in a barrack. You didn't have a barrack all to yourself. And they'd hang a sheet or a blanket, and that's how they lived for several years. And yes, children even had to report to these, to these camps and these detention centers, and that's how they lived. They, but the Japanese Americans were very resourceful. I mean, they went in and they had their own schools, created their own classrooms, and tried to get on with life. Had baseball teams but in the beginning they had to really send in the baseball bats later on because it was considered a weapon, so you couldn't take it originally. When I taught children, especially elementary school children, I get boxes, and I have them bring in a favorite item that they like, a toy or whatever. And I have them decide, what they're going to put in one box they have to leave behind, and the other box they can take with them. And a lot of times, if there wasn't room for that favorite item, they had to leave it behind. And then I would say, well, you're going away, you've done nothing wrong, you're going to a prison camp, is that right? And in unison I get this, no. Even from 5-year-olds. So 5-year-olds even understand this. My father learned about the Constitution in high school. So I love talking to high school kids because I say, this document is about you. And my father thought he had rights. He thought he had civil rights. But no one had any rights at all if you were Japanese American. Your due process was totally stripped away from you. So by the time my father's case, through appeals and through the years, so he was arrested on May 30th, 1942, and so by the time his case got up to the Supreme Court, it was December 18th, 1944, then he thought for sure the Supreme Court would see that this was unconstitutional. And he was so thoroughly disgusted that, that they didn't see that this was wrong. Now fast forward, this is 1966. So this is my father with a crew cut. And this is my mother, 92. She's still living, but she's not in good health. She's been here though. She was at the Jackson Center, in 2002, right? And very much a part of my father's life. They were married for 58 years when my father passed away, and was very supportive of my father. They met in Detroit, Michigan. So towards the end of the war, the government in their wisdom said, gee, what are we going to do with 120,000 people when this war is over? And they knew the war was going to be over. So they sent in community leaders to help people get jobs. Now, you could go east, but you couldn't go west until the war was over. So my father ended up in Detroit, Michigan, because my father's youngest brother was there visiting, and then that's where my parents met and married. But my mother was born in South Carolina, and they couldn't go back to South Carolina to get married because of the anti-racial marriage laws, and they couldn't even get married in California at the time either. So they got married in Detroit. But they went back to California about 1949 because my grandmother wasn't very well. And the little guy here is my brother Ken, who's 4 years younger, and he was responsible for the documentary of the trailer you just saw of civil wrongs and rights, the Korematsu story. My mother had given my brother that challenge, said, well, everybody else is making a documentary about their families, why don't you? And so he took on the challenge with another attorney friend, thinking, oh, okay. But it took him over 11 years to make the documentary because funders didn't think that my brother would be objective enough to make a documentary about his own father, right? He was supposed to be truthful. And so my brother had to bring in his friend, Eric Paul Fournier, to help finish the film. He's a, sorry, I'm having problems with the microphone, a documentary director. And so in 2000, my father kept saying, when's this film going to be finished? And we're just worried, because my father's getting elderly. And so in 2000, we had the world premiere. And in 2002, it actually received 2 Emmys for Best Director and Best Editing. And I'll talk a little bit more about the curriculum kit later on, but you have we were able to get a grant and have the documentary cut down to 24-minute version from 60-minute, and it's going to be in your teaching kits. So I'm the girl here in the back is me at 16, and you can tell I spent all summer at Lake Berryessa in California water skiing. I look more like an American Indian than I do a Japanese American, at least that's what I was told. And I was in high school studying American history, 16 years old, right? 16 years old, American history class. And I had a friend named Maya who was Sansei, third generation like me. And my social studies teacher had assigned a little paperback book. They were all different subjects to each of the students in the class. There's about 35 of us. And we were to read the book and get up in front of the class and give a book report. And the book that my friend Maya had was called Concentration Camps USA. And she gets up and she talks about the Japanese American internment. Oh, that's interesting. I never heard about that before. What's that about? And then she kind of keeps going on and explaining it. And then she said, but there was this one man who resisted the military orders. And it ended up to be a famous Supreme Court case, Korematsu versus the United States. Oh, that's slimy. And the only thing I knew is that Korematsu, I've been told, was a very unusual Japanese name. It's not like Suzuki, you know, or motorcycles or any of those. And so then, of course, as you probably can see when you're teaching your kids, it's just like my brain just went blank. I mean, I thought, who is this? I thought, well, maybe it's my father's oldest brother, because he didn't turn out to be such a shining light after all. Or maybe it was one of my grandfather's brothers who had been here before Pearl Harbor, but then we didn't hear much about him, so I don't know what happened to him. And then it was the last class of the day, and I asked my friend Maya, what's this about? And she said, oh, I think this is about your father. No! Somebody would have told me. And of course, this is the day before cell phones, right? I mean, there's no cell phone. I'm trying to go to the payphone. There's somebody that's in front of me, and I'm, prancing around. Finally, try to call my mother. The line's busy. My mother, as John knows, could talk. And so then I run home, and I told her what this was about, what had happened that day, and she said, yes, this is about your father. And I said, well, when was somebody going to tell me? Well, when you got to be a little older. I'm 16, I'm going to be going to college, I am older. And then she said, you get the standard answer, well, wait till your father gets home, and then you can talk to him. So I had to wait several hours because he had experienced employment discrimination, and they had also experienced housing discrimination. And so I asked him, and he said, well, it happened a long time ago, and what he felt like he did was right, and the government was wrong. And it was that simple and clear. And so I didn't know what to ask him, and so I asked him, I said, well, can you vote? And he said yes, he could vote. And so voting was always very, very important to my father and to my parents. They even worked in the voting polls later on in life. And so I always encourage young students, that voting is really one of the precious gifts that we have as American citizens. And he would tell that to students as well. So I knew that was, later in life, that was really important to him. But then, several years later, he decided he wanted his real estate license because he had faced all this discrimination in housing. Went to the local junior college, took the test, passed the test with flying colors, and then you have to fill out a form. Down at the bottom it says, do you have a prison record? And because he did, he was denied his California real estate license. And he was just so upset, just, really disgusted because he really felt like he had never done anything wrong. The irony to the story is that my brother found out the same way in high school. So obviously, our family did not talk at the dinner table. So fast forward, this is 1983. This is, so the previous picture was 1966, 1983. And by that time, Professor Peter Irons, who is here, along with another researcher, found the evidence in Washington, D.C. that proved that there was no military necessity for the Japanese and Japanese Americans to be forced removed from their home. At the time of my father's Supreme Court case, they found the documents that the Department of Justice lied to the Supreme Court, altered evidence, destroyed evidence. So on that basis, they were able to reopen my father's case under an unknown legal term called writ of quorum nobis, meaning that an error has been made before us. So an error had been made before the courts. And because he had served his total sentence, and he had had when he was his first hearing, he had been found guilty of disobeying the military orders. So he had a 7-year probation. And he had fulfilled all that successfully, so therefore they were able to reopen the case. And so Peter Irons went to my father, and I didn't know until that time that my father had always been looking for someone to help him. My parents talked about this, of course not in front of my brother and I, but they didn't know how to do that. They thought, you know, attorneys are very expensive. And they didn't know any attorneys. So, but my father never gave up hope. You know, that's something to say to a child. When someone really believes deep down inside that they are right, he never gave up hope. And so when Peter Irons came to him to say, we've got this evidence, do you want to reopen your case? He said yes. Before, we'd have law students who would call up my father, and he went to UC Berkeley at one time and spoke, but it was like they attacked him for not kind of being a rebel, I mean, you know, being mad or angry at the government. And my father was never that type of person. He wasn't bitter, he wasn't angry, and he was a person that lived by his principles. And not everyone can say that. You know, that's what made him so special. So when people got to meet him, you know, like John, they found him very endearing because he just had this heart of gold, and sometimes people even took advantage of that. But these attorneys who basically are about my age, Sansei attorneys, when we all met them at my parents' house the first time, I heard my father say to Peter Irons, gee, these kids look like high school kids. Do you think they know what they're doing? And Professor Irons said, yes, Fred, you know, these are some of the best attorneys. And of course, they had a big stake too, because they could lose Korematsu versus the United States all over again. And two, you know, there weren't all Japanese Americans. We had some Caucasians and other Asian attorneys in there. But they also wanted their families vindicated. So it was a big risk, and for my father, because he had been vilified from the time that he decided to avoid that executive order by his own Japanese community. So when he went into Tiananmen Assembly Center and then on to Topaz, he was treated like a pariah. No one wanted anything to do with him. They thought, oh, that Fred, he thinks he's too good for us. You know, they thought that if they associated with my father, some harm might come to them. So growing up, my family and I were not part of the Japanese American community. We were basically ostracized. And we had our immediate family and some friends, but we were not part of the Japanese American community at large. So in November 1983, Judge Marilyn Hall Patel in the Federal Court of Northern California overturned my father's conviction. And it really set the precedent for the redress of reparations bill that was eventually signed by President Reagan in October 1988. So actually this is the 25th anniversary of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. And I was just in Washington, D.C. for another event. And the National Archives had brought out the original Executive Order 9066, which didn't look like much at all. It was like 3 pages of stationery that the President signed. Didn't have really any kind of official-looking logo at the top. And then you had this other document that had this big, huge logo and Ronald Reagan's signature on it, and very kind of official-looking. So they were like bookend documents. It was just so kind of stunning to see what happened, through history, really. It was really exciting. So and because of my father had been part of that redress movement, this is the letter of the official apology. And the Japanese Americans, they just wanted the apology. They added a monetary figure to it because you don't get the government's attention unless you throw money at it. I mean, look at the mess we're in now. And so each recipient who had to be living received $20,000. But for most people, that wasn't the point. And many people just lost everything. When people came back, I mean, they were living wherever. They got $25 and a bus ticket when they left these camps. They really received nothing and had to start all over. So this is the letter and the check. And because of my father's work for redress and then afterwards, he crisscrossed the United States. He's my inspiration. He would speak to anybody who would listen because he thought it was important to tell his own story and that of the Japanese American incarceration, because he always felt like people need to learn. And years ago I would ask people if they knew about the internment. Oh, they heard something about it, but they didn't really know much. And so it was important to him to reach as many people as he could, and I'm hoping to do the same. When he received, this is obviously with President Clinton, he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and I'll tell you another quick story. This date is January 15th, 1998. Actually, it was Martin Luther King's birthday, so that was really very significant. A month before, in December, the phone rings at my parents' house. It's about 9 o'clock in the morning, and my father answers the phone. Now, my father usually never answers the phone. It's always my mother. But he answers the phone, and so at the other end of the line, he hears, "Mr. Korematsu?" "Yes." Well, Mr. Korematsu, this is the White House." "Okay." Well, Mr. Korematsu, are you well?" "Oh, mind you, they just woke him up." "I'm okay." Well, Mr. Korematsu, President Clinton would like to give you the Presidential Medal of Freedom." "Okay." Well, Mr. Korematsu, can you come to the White House next month on January 15th to receive this honor?" "I don't know, you have to speak to my wife." Now, my mother, as John will tell you, is a suspicious type. So she grills this guy, I think almost for an hour, because she just thought this was a joke. Now you would think that if you're going to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom, you might get this nice letter in the mail with a gold seal from the White House that says, "Mr. Korematsu, congratulations, blah, blah, blah." No, they don't do it that way. And so after a while, then my mother says, "Okay, well, okay, I guess I believe you." And the aide says, "Well, we'll call back, with some other details. You get yourself organized," and which, my mother thought, okay, well, they'll just call back and tell us what's going to go on. So the aide calls back and says, "Well, Mrs. Korematsu, have you made your plane reservations and bought your tickets and which hotel you're staying at and those other kinds of details. And my mother says, well, aren't you sending an airline ticket? At least for my husband, and making the hotel accommodations? No, Mrs. Korematsu, you need to be responsible for your own expenses. So, as I tell students, if you want to receive the Presidential Medal, start saving your pennies now. You know? And so my father was a very, very practical person. And so he said, well, you know, he didn't have a pension, you know, employment had always been a problem, and he was still kind of doing some drafting. He was a structural draftsman after the war, so he was doing some freelance work at home, and you don't get paid very much. And then, so my father said, well, you know, it's just too expensive to go to Washington, D.C. Tell the president to send the medal to me in the mail. So we're all panicked. No, Daddy, we'll find a way. And so we all did. But that was my father. And so when he received this, he received this honor like so many others on behalf of all the Japanese and Japanese Americans that were incarcerated. And the only thing is he wished his parents had been there that day. Because with him taking that stand against the government, you know, my grandfather was disgusted and my grandmother was ashamed. You know, they brought shame to the family, right? They didn't really support him. I mean, my grandmother loved him, but it did. And even his three brothers did not want my father to take his case all the way to the Supreme Court. And in fact, when my father reopened his case in '83, only Uncle Joe the youngest was still living, and he still did not want my father to reopen his case. Why do you want to bring all that up? It's just going to be a problem for everybody. So my father basically went it alone. This is not a Photoshop photo, and I'll tell you that Rosa Parks was just as gentle and kind as my father. And so my father's story, like hers, is not just an ethnic story, it's an American story. And we have 3 schools now, public schools named after my father in the Bay Area. And this photograph was taken in circa 1940, like the other one in the nursery. And if you ever get to Washington, D.C., go to the National Portrait Gallery on the 2nd floor, next to the President's Gallery. And my father is the first Asian American to have his photograph there in a permanent exhibit called Struggle for Justice. And with all that, people wanted Fred Korematsu Day for the state of California. And it's January 30th is my father's birthday, and then that's in perpetuity. So my goal is to have a national Fred Korematsu Day someday, because he's the springboard that for all those other Asian American stories in this country. And you know, it's with Martin Luther King and Cesar Chavez and Rosa Parks. These are the types of people who believed in nonviolence and in order to protect our civil rights. So if my father were here, he would say, when you see something wrong, don't be afraid to speak up. Thank you.
Great. The floor is open for questions.
Any burning questions? Yes.
Just a couple things. The kids, those teachers here in middle school and those who are elementary, are the kids also for elementary? Or
Yes. So I'll go through that. But there's we have a teacher's. Well, I'll go through it now. We have a teacher's guide, and the charge was to create curriculum, and we only had 3 months, so we had to draw from a lot of other resources. But we have elementary, middle school, and high school, and we have lesson plans in here as well. And then also, you know, we always welcome input from teachers if you have any great lesson plans that you'd like to share, because I want to update this all the time.
There's a wonderful book by for elementary that talks about Japanese internment.
Oh, what's it called?
It's but it's by the author E. Bunting, and I wrote it like this.
E. Bunty?
Yep, it's a wonderful book, and it talks about man taking his family back to the Campine State.
Is it B-U-N-T-I?
B-U-N-T-I-N-G.
I-N-G, oh, Bunty. Okay,
The
that's...
question I was wondering is, you talked about the reaction of Japanese Americans to your father. Did that change? Has that attitude changed? You know, it's interesting to me that this all was a variety.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was because of my father's disposition. He didn't hold it against the Japanese American community. You know, the day in court, they just kind of enveloped him, and the weight, you know, the shame of all this was lifted off of their shoulders as well. And because they never talked to their families about the incarceration. So my father just, you know, accepted them and then became part of the community. It was just like happened overnight.
Do you speak to Japanese American students? Like you said, you go to talk to
I don't speak Japanese, so it wasn't a very popular language to learn when I was growing up. But yeah, I do. Some of them know. I mean, the young people, some of their families have shared their experiences, especially when they find out that I'm speaking, because they all, especially in the community, all know who Fred Korematsu is. Yes?
This is going back a little bit. It really bothered me as a teacher when you talked about your high school experience and how this book was assigned to another student. Did your teacher help you deal with that?
No. Because I was pretty upset. I said, well, you know, I'm Japanese American too. I mean, I'm only half, but you know, why didn't you give me that book? Why did you give Maya that book? And he didn't really have an answer for me.
That's really upsetting. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean that always bothered me. It still bothered me. So that's why I like talking to teachers, because you know, we need to treat students equally and respect their ethnic backgrounds as well, or at least tell me about it. I mean, hello. I mean, I was only 35 kids in this class, and I went to high school, 2,500 kids, and there was only 6 Asian Americans in a class of 2,500 that were Caucasian. I don't think it's a stretch.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was wondering, whatever happened to the greenhouse, and what did your grandparents have to go back to?
Oh, thank you. My grandfather was fortunate because he was able to give the land, or ask the bank to hold the land and rent it out while he was gone, since he was able to buy the land before the war. So he was able to come back to that, but most people didn't. But it was in total rack and ruin. They had to start basically from scratch to rebuild it. Fortunately, though, there was a boiler room in the back of the property, and that's where that photograph I showed you of my father circa 1940 and the family. My grandfather hid the photographs up in the rafters of the boiler room. So if somebody had destroyed that, we'd have no photographs. So that was really a miracle. But most people, you know, and a lot of people just burn their possessions. Anything that was Japanese, if it was a kimono or whatever, they burn it so they wouldn't be identified as being Japanese. And that's pretty sad. And then some farmers, there is some nice stories where some Caucasian farmers, you know, kind of overlooked their people's farms while they were gone. Strawberry fields, you know, agriculture. That's another backstory. You know, the agriculture industry was such a big issue. That's why people wanted to get rid of the Japanese, because they were doing so well. And we always do this to our immigrants. You know, first the Chinese, the Japanese, and then, you know, the Mexican Americans and Latinos. I mean, when do we learn? Yes.
The book you might be talking about was My House is a Horse Stall. My House is a Horse Stall.
Oh, My House is a Horse
My
Stall.
House is a Horse Stall.
Yeah, I think I've heard about that.
I just looked it up, and there was something called So Far from the Sea.
Oh, So Far from the Sea? Okay.
And then I was wondering about, you said the book Maya read was called Concentration Camps, and we don't call them that now, internment camps. I just wondered if that's your vision.
Well, no, we actually, and I'm glad you brought that up, because you'll see and fill out all those forms, because that's my data. We send out these kids to teachers for free. So if you even know of teachers, you can go to the website, korematsuinstitute.org, sign up, and then we send them out. So that's how we fundraise, for these. But we have in here a page in here. It's just a page, but it's called Power of the Word. And it's about terminology and the euphemisms, right? So the euphemisms is another great subject to discuss. In 1942 we had military necessity. Now we have national security. In 42 is aliens and non-aliens. My father said, I'm not an alien. And now we have documented and undocumented. Then we had in 42 it was racial discrimination. Now we have racial profiling. So 70 years later, we're still dealing with a lot of the same issues, and some of the terms have changed. And this is really important. So we keep the word internment because that's how people recognize it. But like relocation or evacuation, what does evacuation mean? For your own safety, right? Well, the Japanese were not evacuated for their own safety. I mean, that wasn't the case at all. So these types of words are a great source of discussion and writing for your students. I better just tell you quickly what's in here because I'm going to get kicked out. The important thing is that, as I said, is that the DVD, so you have the 24-minute version. You realize you don't have a lot of time to teach, so you can do 24 minutes and then still have discussion. There's a letter that I basically narrate from me, and then there's a small other little documentary about some children at one of my father's schools. But we have this in Japanese subtitles and English subtitles, so especially for people hearing issues, the English subtitles are always really good. And then we developed a viewer's guide to go along with the documentary, so that you've got some questions there you can discuss with your students. And then because the reason I think my father's legacy keeps growing is the relevancy. So like after 9/11, my father and the Japanese American Citizen Leagues were the first to speak out against the idea from the Bush administration to round up Arab and Muslim Americans and put them in concentration camps. Actually, Attorney General Ashcroft cited Korematsu versus the United States because it's still on the Supreme Court record. So that's the thing. It's discredited, right? But it's still there. And some people said, well, maybe we should try to, reverse that. But and so we, in recognition of the 10th anniversary of the 9/11, Voice of Witness did a book called Patriot Acts. They asked me to write the foreword, and we took 3 of the stories that are targeted against kids and put them in the book. And then also another book that was written, a graphic novel called Fred Korematsu, All-American Hero, about this Muslim American little girl who was bullied. That's another good subject, bullying, after 9/11. And her next door neighbor just happens to be this Japanese American woman who was incarcerated and says, let me tell you the story about Fred Korematsu. And then there's a timeline along with it. And we have a one-day also PowerPoint teaching kit, similar to some of the pictures, and some posters. So, enjoy. Yes?
Can we contact you through the website?
Pardon?
Can we contact you through the website?
Yes.